This is Biology 101, Chapter 1, Introduction. Okay, so we're going to start off this course and this entire semester with the question, what is biology? Because really that's what we're here to discover. And very often when we talk to students about biology, the definition that comes to mind is that biology is the study of life. And so when we think about that, typically this is what we envision. Okay, we've got all kinds of plants and animals, all of these living things that we're very familiar with seeing in the world around us. Some of it's cute, some of it's not so cute, but all of these are what we think about when we think of biology, living things. However, what we're going to see and discover over the course of the semester is that really we're going to be looking at these living things, but at a much different level. So we're taking a slightly different approach. And so I want for you to imagine that really biology is also this, and really in Biology 101, this is what we focus on. So what we see here is a variety of different types of molecules. So we've got DNA up at the top left of the screen, some proteins, a carbohydrate. We've got some reactions that take place in living things that are very important. Here we've got cellular respiration that occurs in the mitochondria, which is how we make ATP. Here we're looking at a plasma membrane, an entire cell, photosynthesis. And so all of these very, very small processes and molecules that are inside of living things drive those living things and the things that they do. But what we're also going to discover is that we can look at a much grander scale, so we can go beyond an individual living thing and look at how those living things interact with each other and how they interact with their environment. And so this is just a quick diagram showing the biosphere. So we can look at all of these various ecosystems and how the things inside of those ecosystems function together. And then we're also going to consider conservation biology and environmental biology at some point at the end of the semester, because we really want to see how do we sustain life on this planet. And so biology, while it is about living things and the study of life, there's much more to it than individual organisms and how they're classified. We're going to see how those organisms actually function at a molecular level. So again, biology is the study of life, the scientific study of life. And so what does that mean? There are a variety of characteristics that make up living things, or that define what a living thing is. And the first thing is that all living things are made of cells. Cells are the basic unit of life. All living things are going to be highly organized, and we see that organization at different levels. So when you look at the molecular level, there's organization, but also when we look at the cellular level, there's organization. And you're going to see those different levels in living things. All living things use energy and nutrients, meaning that they're going to interact with the parts of their environment that may be non-living. All living things grow and maintain homeostasis. And what we mean by that is biological balance. And we'll get into some discussions a little bit later on about what homeostasis actually is. All living things are responsive to the environment. Okay, so we respond to stimuli that we see or that we experience in our environment. All living things reproduce. This is how those living things continue to exist, and they are all adapted to their environment through the process of natural selection and evolution. So as we look at those characteristics of life, I want for you guys to kind of think about that as we look at the 8 themes of biology that we're going to see in the rest of this chapter. So this chapter is really kind of a preview of the course, if you will. It kind of gives a look at what we're going to be studying throughout the rest of the course and how those concepts all tie together. And so this chapter focuses on 8 unifying themes that we see repeated at various levels of biology. And so the first of those is that new properties emerge at each level in the biological hierarchy. And what that means is, if we look at this diagram on the right, you can see that up here at the top where it says atoms, we start with very, very small structures called atoms. This is the smallest unit of matter. And those atoms will come together to build molecules. Let's see if I can get my cursor back. Okay, those atoms come together to build molecules. Now, atoms have certain properties. But when we start putting them together and build molecules, those molecules now have new and different properties. So we've seen new properties emerge at that next level in the hierarchy. And that continues to happen as those molecules come together to build organelles, and those organelles come together to build cells, which come together to build tissues and organ systems, and eventually an entire organism. Definitely we can say that this organism has much different properties than this individual cell or these atoms. Okay, so at each level of that hierarchy, we see new properties that emerge. And the arrangement of these various parts is very important to determine those properties. Okay, our second unifying theme is that organisms interact with other organisms and with the physical environment. Okay, so we see that definitely organisms are going to interact, whether it's in feeding relationships or competitive relationships. Sometimes we see predator-prey relationships, and we'll discuss a lot of those types of interactions that we see between species a little bit later on. Within a species, we also sometimes see competition. We see that there are mating relationships that occur as well. And so there are definitely interactions between organisms, but also we see that organisms interact with their physical environment. So that would be some of the non-living parts of the environment around them. Things like the atmosphere, the soil, there are definitely interactions there. And so these interactions may be good, may be bad, and the sum total of those interactions is really what determines what's going on in an ecosystem. Our third unifying theme is that life requires energy transfer and transformation. We'll start getting into this a little bit more in our third unit, and then also in our unit on ecology. But essentially, energy is necessary for all living things to function, and that energy has to come from somewhere. It can't be created or destroyed, and so it has to be transferred from one organism to the next. And that usually is going to occur through a feeding relationship. However, our original source of energy is from the sun, because the sun provides energy to power photosynthesis for plants to create food that then feeds everything else in that particular food chain or food web. And so we see those interactions between organisms leading to transfers of energy between organisms. Okay, our fourth unifying theme is that structure and function are correlated at all levels of biological organization. And you'll hear many times throughout this course that form fits function. We'll see that at all levels, whether we're talking about molecules or whether we're talking about an entire organism. If you look at the example that we're showing here below, we're looking at birds and how birds have the ability of flight. Well, there are several things that contribute to that ability. One of those is that the wings of the birds have a very aerodynamic shape, which makes them suitable for flying. But in addition to that, if we look at a lower level, even down to the bones of those birds, the bones are structured in such a way that they're very, very strong, okay, because they have these it's called kind of a honeycombed structure inside, but essentially we've got bridges between the two parts of the bone structure, but there's a lot of air and a lot of space in between those bridges, which makes the bones very light. So they're very strong, but also very light, which is an excellent characteristic to have for flight. So sometimes we can look at the structure of something to give a clue to the function, but we're always going to see that there's a correlation between the structure and the job that that particular thing does. Okay, our fifth unifying theme is that the cell is the basic unit of structure and function, and we'll discover this a little bit in Unit 2. We'll talk about the cell theory, which discusses that cells reproduce, all cells have to come from pre-existing cells, and cells are the basic unit of life. Okay, so we say they're the basic unit of structure and function, and also the basic unit of life. Now, when we look at cells, there are a variety of different cell types. And one of the easiest ways to differentiate cells is by looking at eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. And again, we'll discover this concept a little bit more in Unit 2. But a eukaryotic cell is going to be one that's a little more complex. They tend to be larger. Eukaryotic cells have a nucleus and also have organelles, whereas prokaryotic cells are going to tend to be those that are smaller and less complex. They tend to be single-celled organisms only, so bacteria are very, very good examples of prokaryotic organisms, and they don't have a nucleus in these cells and no membrane-bound organelles, so no mitochondria, no chloroplasts, none of that stuff. So prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells is kind of one of the first ways that you might distinguish between cell types. And then as you look at those different categories, for example, within eukaryotic cells, you might start to look at plant and animal cells and the differences between those. And those are things that we will discover in Unit 2. But cells are the basic unit of structure and function, or the basic unit of life. Okay, our sixth unifying theme of biology is that the continuity of life is based on heritable information in the form of DNA. And really what this means is that we're able to pass traits from one generation to the next through the DNA that's possessed in our cells. We know that DNA contains genes, and we can look at DNA in the form of chromosomes in the nucleus of cells. Now, we'll talk about DNA and genetics and heritability and all of those concepts in Unit 4, but essentially DNA has a code, and you can see in the example here in this single strand of DNA, those letters represent a code that we see in DNA. And that code stores information about how to make proteins, which determine how that cell will function and gives certain traits to the organism. So every difference that we see between individuals is going to be based on differences in their DNA. Okay, the seventh unifying theme is that feedback mechanisms regulate biological systems. And what we mean by a feedback mechanism is that the end product of a pathway feeds back into that pathway and has a result. So it allows the body to control opposing pathways and functions. What we're looking at here is two different examples. So at the top we have a negative feedback mechanism, and at the bottom we have a positive feedback mechanism. So if we look at the negative feedback mechanism as our first example, you can see that in this pathway we have several chemical reactions, and each reaction is going to be catalyzed by an enzyme. Now those terms might not make a whole lot of sense now, but as we move forward in the course, you'll learn what we mean by that. But essentially we're going from A to D. We're making D through this pathway. But what happens is in a negative feedback pathway, as D accumulates, and we can see this here to the left, D starts to accumulate, it now has the ability to feed back into an early step of that pathway and turn it off. So D is able to affect the activity of enzyme 1 and turn it off so that the pathway no longer functions. So as we build up enough of D, we stop making it so that we aren't wasting energy making something we don't need any more of. In the other example, in our positive feedback mechanism, we're going from W to Z, and again there are several steps, and each of those reactions is catalyzed by a different enzyme. Here, as we accumulate our product, we actually see that it feeds back into the pathway and stimulates or turns on the pathway so that we get even more of that product being built up. And that's really important in some processes like childbirth, for example. We see that positive feedback is a necessary component of childbirth because it helps to keep those contractions coming faster and faster so that the actual labor and delivery of that baby does occur. Okay, so we see both of these mechanisms occur in living things, and you'll see negative feedback is more common than positive feedback, but we do see that both play an important role in helping to maintain balance in living things. Okay, our last unifying theme of biology is evolution. Now this is a core theme of biology, and really what I try to encourage students to do is to stop thinking of evolution like this. Very often I hear students say things like, I didn't come from monkeys, because that's really all we want to focus on when we talk about evolution. And while that is a part of evolution, humans are primates, which means we are related to monkeys, apes, chimpanzees. We are related. That is not really what evolution is all about. Okay, human origin is not what evolution is all about. It's all about the fact that we see change occur over time. And that change has led to the tremendous amount of diversity that we see on our planet. And so if you look at this new diagram that I've got up here, you can see that this is basically a family tree showing how all of these different organisms are related to each other. And the further apart they are, the less related they are, and that makes sense. But we need to stop thinking about evolution from a human-centered approach and start looking at it as an overall approach or an overall process and what's actually going on. And what we see is that evolution is really the only thing out there that explains the unity and diversity that we see in the world. And what we mean by that is there's all this diversity. So there's this tremendous number of species out there. And this diagram doesn't even touch it, doesn't come close. But when we look at those individual species, we see that there's also a significant amount of unity, even between, a human and a plant. We see that there's the same genetic code, the same protein code, and so that lends itself to these ideas of evolution and the fact that there is a common ancestor or common origin from which all other living things evolved. And so I hope that everyone will be able to keep an open mind as you go through the course and actually try to understand, at least, even if you don't fully embrace it, try to understand these concepts of evolution and what scientists are trying to show actually happens in this process. Okay, we've already kind of discussed unity and diversity a little bit, and we've said that evolution clearly explains those things, that we have so much diversity in life, but we also see a great deal of unity. Now, one of the things about diversity that we're just going to very, very briefly touch on in this class is that there are actually 3 different classification domains. So the domain is the highest level of classification, the most inclusive level of classification that we see. And then as you go down from domain to kingdom and then eventually down to genus and species, you start to get a little bit more specific and narrow down to individual species. Okay, all the levels in between are different levels of relatedness between organisms. And so those 3 classification domains are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And so humans fall into the eukarya domain. Once we go below the domain level, you can see that we start to kind of narrow down. So in this particular example, you can see that the next level is a kingdom, and within kingdom Animalia, we have this tremendous diversity of organisms. And then if we go to the next level, which is the phylum, we've lost some of that diversity, okay, but we still have a great deal of organisms. And then when we start looking at classes, we lose a little bit more. Order, we lose a little bit more. Family, genus, until we eventually narrow down to an individual species. So a species would be the least inclusive level because it includes only one individual species, whereas domains would be the most inclusive level of organization because they would include all of the species within that particular area. Okay, the last thing that we're going to discuss in this particular chapter is the scientific method. The scientific method is really important in this course because you will be writing a paper in the laboratory component of the course about the scientific method or using the scientific method about a particular experiment that you're going to do in the lab. Now, the scientific method is a very structured, inquiry-based search for information and explanations. And the traditional steps that we look at in the scientific method are that you would first make observations about the world around you and identify questions that you want to ask in order to form your experiment. Then you would research and formulate a hypothesis about that question. Okay, when we say research, this may include a Google search, but typically we're going to be looking in the literature. We're going to be looking at what kinds of things have other scientists published on this particular topic. And once we've identified the information that's out there, and we've determined that nobody else has already done this research, then we would go on to come up with a hypothesis. So we've got a question, and now we need to figure out what do we think the answer to that question is based on our research. Once you have your hypothesis, then you would design an experiment and collect data. One of the things about the hypothesis is that it needs to be both testable and falsifiable. So that means that you have to be able to show that your hypothesis is wrong. You will never be able to prove that your hypothesis is correct. Okay, that is one important thing that we need to understand about science, is that you will not prove a hypothesis, because you never know. If you had asked the question a slightly different way, maybe you would have seen that your hypothesis was wrong. Okay, so there's always the chance that someone could come behind you and do an experiment to show that your hypothesis was wrong. So we would never say that we've proven our hypothesis. However, we do want to look for ways to disprove our hypothesis or show that it is false, because that's something that we can do. Okay, so your hypothesis needs to be falsifiable. If it's not, then it's not really a viable or valid hypothesis. And then it needs to be testable, meaning that you have to be able to actually collect data and draw a conclusion from that data about your hypothesis. So you would design your experiment so that it's able to address both of those things, okay, so that it's well controlled and well designed to address your hypothesis. Then you would collect the data, analyze the results, and very often this is going to involve some kind of statistical measurement. And then once you've analyzed the results, you might not get what you expected, so you might need to revise your hypothesis and go back and look at it again, and design new experiments, come up with new questions. And so science is kind of one of those ongoing things. It is very rarely an open and shut case. Okay, there's typically going to be a new question that comes up, or maybe you need to readdress the hypothesis or revise the experiment. When you do have solid conclusions about your hypothesis, one of the most important things that a scientist is going to do is to form conclusions and share those conclusions. Because if you remember, we said that you went into the literature and you do a research, or you do some research to try to identify other experiments that have been done, what's already known. And so if you don't publish or share your results, then other scientists don't know that you've already done the experiment. And so that's why it's really important to do that step. But you would want to wait until you've done many replicates of the experiment, meaning that you've done it several times and you always get the same result. Okay? All right, so again, the scientific method, kind of an overview. When we talk about it, we're typically looking at an experiment in the lab. However, this is not necessary. We can see the scientific method performed in our daily lives. So for example, if you make the observation that your flashlight's not working, then you would maybe ask the question, why is my flashlight not working? So maybe hypothesis number one is that your batteries are dead. And so your prediction would be that if you replace the batteries, it fixes the problem. So your test would be you replace the batteries and then try the flashlight. Well, it didn't work. So you have now falsified or disproven your hypothesis. So now you would maybe look at hypothesis number two, and that would be that the bulb in your flashlight is burnt out. And so in order to test this, you're going to say, okay, if I replace the bulb, that should fix the problem. So you go to the store, you buy a new bulb, put that in, and look, this does not falsify your hypothesis. This actually supports your hypothesis. It does not prove your hypothesis, because maybe there was actually a bad connection. The bulb was fine, but there was a bad connection, and when you replace the new bulb or replace the bulb, it actually fixed the connection problem too. So we can't say that we proved our hypothesis, but we can say that our data supports our hypothesis. Okay? All right, so that's really it for Chapter 1. If we're looking forward to the rest of this course, which hopefully you are, you should know that in Module 1, which Chapter 1 really is part of Module 1, we're going to be very focused on basic chemistry, so we'll be learning about those atoms and molecules and how they come together. In Module 2, we'll be looking at cell biology, so learning about cells and cell structures and how they reproduce. In Module 3, we'll be looking at metabolism, and really we're going to be doing this at the cellular level, but we hope to also maybe discuss how that would impact an overall organism. In Module 4, we'll talk about genetics and how traits are inherited from parent to offspring. And then also we're going to talk a little bit about how how those traits actually get expressed. So how do you get a certain trait from a gene that you have? And then in Module 5, we'll talk about evolution, natural selection, all the processes involved, and how these processes shape the species that we see on the planet. And then we're going to wrap up with ecology. So this is where we're going to start to look at whole organisms and populations and how different populations interact in an ecosystem and how those ecosystems function. So it's a very exciting course. Hopefully you'll have a good time, and I look forward to continuing these lectures.